1924, Mount St. Helens, Washington. What would be an amazing encounter would soon turn into one of the most terrifying nights in their cabin. During the middle of the summer, 5 miners were finding a good bit of gold in their area of operations, but it wasn't before long all this would change. Having worked the area for quite some time now, the discovery of large footprints were not uncommon for the group of miners. Many times at night, whistlings could be heard spanning from ridge to ridge while the miners slept. It wasn't until 2 of them headed out to the spring to restock their water that things would take a turn for the worse. The spring, only being about 100 yards from the cabin, was still far enough away that the miners felt the need to bring their rifles with them, especially after the previous ongoings. When they reached the spring, one of the miners yelled as he raised his rifle. The other miner followed suit. In front of them was a 7-foot-tall creature with blackish-brown hair all over, dodging its head from behind the trees. As the miners began shooting, the creature eventually disappeared from their view. The miners quickly ran back to their cabin with the packed water to tell the rest of the group of their encounter. It didn't take much, however, to convince the others to all agree in packing up and leaving the next day, as it was already starting to get dark outside. The cabin the miners stayed in was made of pine logs. Built by the miners themselves, they constructed it to be sturdy and well supported. There were no windows, but there was a fireplace on one side of the cabin and a sleeping area opposite. The miners soon found themselves all asleep, but come midnight, one by one the miners woke up to sounds of thudding outside on the cabin walls, and one of their own on the floor yelling and moving around with a large chinking upon him. It had been knocked loose from between the logs and had fallen over on top of him. The group helped remove the chinking off the man, and then could hear a large amount of commotion coming from outside the cabin walls, as if there were several people trampling around. As quick as they could, the miners all grabbed their rifles. One of them looked through the new hole in the wall from the missing chinking, and could see 3 large creatures, all standing together. But the miners knew there was many, many more of them around, solely judging by the sounds. And so begins the unfateful night attack of these creatures. Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor Field, and I hope you enjoyed that beginning intro that I had set up for this episode. This is an exclusive Patreon episode as well, so today we're going to dive a little bit more into the history of Ape Canyon. Now, I just wanted to kind of dive into the location and kind of explain a little bit more of the whole event. Now, with Ape Canyon, this name derived obviously from the attack that took place in 1924. This area, though, is basically a narrow gorge that sits just northeast of Washington's Mount St. Helens. And it was, of course, back in that time, run widely in Washington and Oregon newspapers. And as I mentioned, it was on a summer night, July 1924, that this small cabin housing a group of miners came under attack by a group of these wild ape men. And this is basically the account, is that these 5 miners had seen them. Now, mind you, all 5 did survive the incident, and they were convinced of its facts. Obviously, that when they were asleep, that's when the attack started. Out of nowhere, the cabin that they had, again, they built this cabin, was being hit with stones, and they were being thrown by these creatures from all sides of the terrain. Now the men began to shoot back, retaliate. The attacks would kind of hold off, and then once the guys stopped shooting, the attacks would start back up again just minutes after. So there was a point now, and I mentioned this in the intro, the chinking that came out. It left a hole in the cabin. One of these creatures put its arm through this hole, and it actually grabbed an axe off the wall, and it was pulling it. Now, that's one of the most interesting facts that, at least to me, that could really derive from this story. I just think that's terrifying, of this creature trying to grab this axe and pull it through the wall, and who the heck knows what he's going to do with it. But there is that intelligence there of what they're capable of. I do believe as well, though, from my research that they stopped it from getting the axe out. They managed to pull it back into the cabin. The whole attack and encounter continued right up until the first break of light. So the men inside finally creeped out of the cabin. One of them, I guess, had, according to what their experience was in the story, had seen one of the creatures standing off in the distance. That is as far as it goes. They got the heck out of there as soon as possible. Now, I know that there's some of the miners had written books. I believe Fred Beck would go on actually to be writing a book about that experience of that night. And I did read it. There was some very interesting things about talking about extra-dimensional beings and many other theories of what was really going on there. I won't be necessarily touching upon that. That's something I'll probably get into with Reuben at a later date. However, the whole experience, though, is very, very intriguing. And most people don't realize that it is not limited to just these Bigfoot and these ape men, but specifically, again, to extra-dimensional experiences and another plane of parallel existence that kind of is going alongside this. However, with us saving that topic for another day, the site that actually hosted the cabin is no longer 100% known where that is, to my knowledge. But the canyon in general, obviously, it continues to be a great hiking destination. And there was an eruption from Mount St. Helens in 1980. But it did alter the terrain a bit. But again, it's still a very popular hiking destination. You can check it out on Google Maps if you want. So if we look back, there was an interesting disappearance. And this man was named Jim Carter. So in 1950, in May, he was out hiking near Mount St. Helens, Washington. And this is, again, labeled as a very strange disappearance. So he was 32 years old. He was in a 20-member climbing party, and they were all from Seattle, and they headed out to Mount St. Helens in Washington in May of 1950. Now, on the way down from the mountain, I believe from my research, Jim Carter he kind of went up ahead, left the other climbers, I guess, near a landmark. And this landmark is called the Dog's Head. And this is around roughly 8,000 feet. So Jim Carter, he was definitely experienced. He had a lot of experience, I guess, with skiing and just being out in mountains. And judging from what the account was with the other hikers, basically it was just the other climbers were resting up, and I guess he was just going to go ski around and do a photo. Now, from here, this is when Jim Carter had taken off down the mountain, and I guess he was going a little bit too dangerously fast, taking a little bit of chance. And I guess, again, this is claimed from the group that was nearby with him. So it seems like he had jumped over a few crevices, and this is where it's kind of mentioned, like, okay, was he kind of moving away from something because he was afraid of something, or was he frightened? Why was he moving so aggressively and so rapidly? Even as an experienced skier, there's certain things that you have to take into account that I imagine you can't go. Like, I'm not a professional skier by any means. I like to snowboard, but it's always, to me at least, gauging your path and knowing how you're going to handle and where you're going to go. But in these situations, if something is behind you, you're going to all of a sudden make really dangerous and drastic moves. And I think in a scenario where you're limited to only moving forward and you have no chance you can't afford to mess up, it's interesting because I feel like he didn't mess up. He was clearly making a conscious decision to take these chances. Large crevices, I believe it's 3 is what they accounted for. And this was the last time that he was seen alive. So after this disappearance, that was it. And a lot of people do speculate that maybe this was linked to the Ape Canyon attack in 1924. So when they started going off to search for him, they did a large search of the area for weeks. And again, this was executed by experienced search and rescue teams. They couldn't find traces of him. They did find the discarded film box, though, at the point where he had taken the picture. So when they discovered that area, they were able to actually follow his tracks, which reached the steep side of Ape Canyon. Now, the searchers, I guess, were kind of shocked because they could deduce that Carter was in such a hurry here. He had gone right down to the more steeper part of these canyon walls. But again, where you think you would find him at the bottom, he wasn't there. So they used airplanes again to track where the tracks were being traced from. And I guess at this point, they had eventually disappeared into complete wilderness. So this whole scenario of his disappearance is still an unsolved mystery to this day. Now, that is coming from one of the members of the Seattle Search and Rescue. And this unit was involved in the operation to find Jim Carter. So it just makes me curious if this group went there, if this is before the eruption, if this group went out there and these things are still, let's say hypothetically, the same group that had to deal with these miners shy 30 years ago, well within a lifespan of a human and or a few other different species of the planet, these things could easily bear a grudge if one of them was killed and a group of them were fighting off miners just 30 years prior. And now you have a group of 20 out there, no cabin this time, not very well equipped, and one goes off on its own. One of these humans goes off alone. That sets up an opportunity. I mean, it's just like anything. Like when you're out with your kids and you're walking down a hiking trail, you always want to keep the kids close because one of the first issues that can happen, if the kid goes too far or falls too far back, there is prey that's watching and will take advantage of that. Cougar attacks. They wait for the kid to get a little too far from the parents and then they attack. There's been here locally scenarios where cougars are actually sitting above on trees, and as the kid gets a little too far ahead, the cougar jumps down and lands on the kid. And this has happened within the last year and a half. Now, I feel like, as I said previously, the tracks are sporadic. He made some really bad calls. Again, when you're going on this trajectory and your only way is down, I definitely wouldn't dismiss the fact that, I made a wrong move. I have to just kind of bite the bullet and go down. I can't stop. He's going left and right. He's going to the steeper part of the canyon, and there's nothing he can do about it. Now, I definitely don't doubt that you kind of cross that threshold of no point of no return, basically. And that would just not be a good spot to be in if you're going into a dangerous area on a slope. It's definitely not a well-groomed ski trail. It's out in the terrain, out in the wild wilderness. So it's just, how did he get into that scenario? Did he get there based on his own maneuverability that he just regretted where he was going? Did something pop out and absolutely terrify him and force him to a way that he didn't want to go? These things, from accounts that I have dived into, they're very good at channeling their prey or their target to certain parts where they want them to go, where there's other ones around. It's just something that even wolves will do as well. And they'll have one wolf kind of steer the prey to where an area where they want it to go. Where did he end up going? Right out into the wilderness where no one could find him. Now, maybe these things would know that that's where they want him to go. Maybe these things know that humans have an ability of tracking. I don't know. I am no expert. But I do think that if this is indeed related to a case of an ape man or a Bigfoot Sasquatch, then I believe that there is a level of intelligence associated with it. That is my belief. Now, it doesn't confirm it by any means. This could have been a cold case of he made a wrong move as an experienced skier up on that hill and it cost him his life. But the tracks did go off into the wilderness. That is something that I find really, really peculiar and mysterious. This is something that I will definitely be getting more into with Reuben, but I do find it very interesting how this experience unfolded. Now, again, there was a eruption that happened in the 80s. So the whole terrain is very, very different now. It's changed, but it is still very much a popular hiking trail. And I would love to go there. I really, really would. I know there is probably not really any photographs of the cabin. I believe I saw one photo of the Ape Canyon cabin, but again, I can't vouch if it was actually a real photo or whatnot. But yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I look forward to getting into the spiritual aspect of it all with Reuben at some point, because we'll talk at some point at the spiritual. We'll talk about this missing strange disappearance of Jim Carter, which again, it goes hand in hand with so many of the missing cases in the wilderness. The freaky thing is, when you look at national parks, the protected areas, a lot of people go missing in them. I was looking at a map the other day, and this map going down south of the border of Canada, and I was discussing this with Reuben actually as well. We looked at the cluster of spots, and directly below where I am living, near the border, there's many, many national parks. It blows my mind how many there are. And when you look at these clusters, there are clusters and clusters and clusters in all these national park areas. And again, it's so easy to get lost off the track. If you take a step going down a highway, which we have a ton here, if I'm heading out east, there's so much country. And as I'm heading out there, I could pull over, I could walk 10 feet into the bush, and you would not see me or know I'm there. And it's everywhere. I think it's very easy, and I'm not going to make this accusation because I will not speak for everyone. But what I believe, at the end of the day, is that when you look at the amount of cities we have, people that live in these cities, you get used to that level of comfort, and you get used to the fact that maybe you take it for granted and that these cities are everywhere. You spend 15 minutes driving out into the woods, but you still don't really accept that our cities are outnumbered by how much barren land and forestry and jungle and Amazon there actually is on this planet. Canada, North America, United States, there's like 80% of it, and I'm pretty confident it's 80%, is covered in trees and forests. There's so much to hide in. And I know some people probably disagree in the fact that, well, it's not possible for a creature to just hide out there in the middle of the bush and whatnot, but if it's a population of only like thousands and thousands, I don't see why not. They can spread pretty thin out there, whereas if you look at us, we have hundreds of thousands of people condensed into tiny little areas. And they just condense us into these little cities. It's just a fascinating thing to ponder, and I think about it a lot. So when you have people that go off these tracks, again, they can get lost. Most people aren't experienced nowadays. I know my father would always say, you could take some of the smartest people, physicists and scientists, rocket engineers, everything like that, and maybe some have a double life and they're experts, but most of the time these people working in the labs and these experienced, brilliant minds, you put them out in the bush, they will die. If you leave them out there for a week, they would not make it. And it's just an interesting thing to think of. Again, I'm not trying to bash them by any means, but I just think it's interesting how disconnected we are from that environment and that network and that lifestyle and that aesthetic out there, that connection. But at the end of the day, these people, they go missing, and it's very interesting really what is really happening out there. People are encountering UFOs, they're encountering these creatures, they're encountering many other cryptids out there in these national parks and in these areas, and it's either it's hushed, it's silenced, people don't want to talk about it, more people go missing. It's one of those things. Do we want to know the answer? Do we want to know what's really going on with these people, these hunters, these hikers that just disappear? I can tell you it terrifies me. In the case of Ape Canyon, I'm just happy that those 5 men actually got out of there with their lives. and it just blows my mind that such a significant event like that happened. I do wonder if things like that still happen to this day. A lot of these experiences that I've heard, a lot of things, they don't sound aggressive. There are some aggressive encounters that I've heard and I've been able to read into, but there's not necessarily a lot that kind of stem around. Again, where do the stories come from? If there's aggressive killings or aggressive stories, then chances are those people are the ones that are missing and don't make it out to tell the stories. Fortunately, though, with these miners, they got out, they were able to account their story. Note, it was caused. I won't say it was definitely like warranted or anything like that, but the attack was brought on when they opened fire on one of these creatures. And it was, to me, an act of self-defense. I couldn't imagine if they didn't have those walls to keep them safe and protect them. These things were desperately trying to get in. These things, from the account that I was reading into in the research, were on the roof. They were trying to dig underneath the walls and crawl in through and I guess underneath, probably no floorboards, but just through the dirt on the ground. They were trying to get in every which way they could. And that cabin wall that these miners had built was their absolute saving grace. I couldn't imagine anything more terrifying than being in that cabin that night. It would have been the longest, probably 11 hours till the first break of day. So I'm going to leave it there for this special episode of diving into Ape Canyon. And I will definitely be getting more in depth on this topic with Reuben next time. So I hope you enjoyed this interesting episode of the Ape Canyon attack. Until next time, I am Taylor Field. Thank you for tuning in to Cryptid Clues, and be sure to check us out on our social media channels and send us a message sometime, cryptidclues@gmail.com. Have a good one.